Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
Welcome, listeners, to the Lens of History studio, and joining me on the couch today with a cup of coffee in hand is Peter Sandeman from the online campaign to save the Royal Navy. Now, how are you today, Peter?
I'm good. Good to speak to you.
Well, look, it's a pleasure to have you in the studio because apart from the stated reasons of looking at issues to do with like the Royal Navy and militaries around the world, one of the reasons I actually started the Lens of History podcast was to try and bring this kind of a thing to the attention of my fellow Kiwis. And while obviously we have the Royal New Zealand Navy in New Zealand, there are still some issues that are very relevant to us because obviously New Zealand is an island nation. But
Sure.
Let's just actually get down to business now that I've introduced you and the subject of today's show. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the Save the Royal Navy online campaign?
Okay. Well, I'm from a naval and military family. Although I haven't served myself, I've always been fascinated by the Navy and written about the Navy for many years. My father, incidentally, was in the Royal Navy for 32 years, and he served in the New Zealand Navy on exchange for quite a while, actually, interestingly. And he had a very good experience there. Back in 2007, my career I'd moved into doing my day job, if you like, was in web design, and there was definitely a kind of gap in the market for a site that was explaining in kind of terms that the public can understand what is happening to the Navy. So that was my kind of inspiration, if you like. The vision of the site really is to talk to people, man on the street, not necessarily the military expert. There are plenty of kind of military forums that are kind of full of acronyms and complicated military terminology that aren't aimed at kind of non-military professionals. So what I was trying to do is present the information in a way that everyone can understand and engage with and debate with. I started the website from kind of small beginnings. It's gradually built up to a site that has kind of substantial traffic. Has the Twitter feed is particularly kind of active, and that's growing fast. And I have although I'm kind of the editor, I have a kind of small group of contributors, advisors, supporters who help with the site. But most of the donkey work is done by myself. That's where we are at the moment.
And just before I move the show along, I think that the point you made about bringing this sort of topic to the more general audience and not just people with military expertise and service, I think that the listener should take, I wouldn't say careful attention to that, but pay heed to it, just because I found the exact same thing when doing research from my own ends, that you can come across a lot of different acronyms in that, and that if you don't sort of actively look into what they mean, you're likely just to be turned away. But, let's just move along, or to the next port, if you like. And it saddens me that I even have to ask this question, particularly given the history of the two Battle of the Atlantics and Trafalgar, but nevertheless, why does the UK need the Royal Navy, and why have so many people forgotten those reasons?
Well, that's a very interesting question. In one sense, it's very obvious why you need a Navy when you're an island nation I don't know whether it's the same for New Zealand, but 95% of our imports and exports arrive by sea. So our dependence on the sea is very clear and very obvious. The vast majority of the population live close to the coast. I think about the furthest we can get away from the sea in the UK is less than 100 miles. So in some ways, it's baffling why we have lost the kind of understanding of our dependence on the sea. I think the explanation is partly to do with air travel, in that people think that because they can hop on a plane and travel to the other side of the world, that they kind of assume that goods and services do the same thing, whereas, of course, only a tiny proportion of goods can be carried by air. So it's partly to do with the kind of immediacy of air travel. I think another reason is, if you like, the internet and speed of communications, is that people don't understand that it takes weeks for their computer to arrive from a ship from the Far East. but they can call the Far East on Skype in an instant. So it's partly to do with that. I guess it's also the fact that we've essentially, obviously in Europe, we've been at peace since the Second World War. So there's a disconnect with our forces, and the action of our forces that is visible and in the media has mainly been soldiers fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. So people can understand that, but they don't necessarily understand the need for the Navy because it's kind of out of sight and out of mind. What the Navy does is kind of disappears over the horizon. Journalists, can't just kind of rock up and film what ships are doing in the way that they can in land-based actions. We've also got the RAF, who have always been very good at their own public relations. There are, say for example, there are something like 40 air shows around the UK every summer, and the RAF is in attendance at most of them. Whereas the Navy, it has a couple of its own air shows, but it's ceased doing Navy Days several years ago. So it's disappeared from public view in a very kind of gradual way. But most people have only a kind of hazy idea of how big the Navy is, what it does for them. I would say the UK public are very supportive of the armed forces in one sense. There's never been better support for the forces on a kind of personal level, but there is not the willingness to pay for them or fund them or really understand them even. So it's a kind of interesting paradox, the situation we're in at the moment. So yes, there is definitely a need for raising the profile of the Navy in particular, because when the RAF and the Army are much more kind of front and centre in the public view and understanding.
We essentially have the same problem in New Zealand, but there's a few differences. The Army and Air Force aren't really centre stage, and just a quick clarifying point, while the majority of New Zealand's exports and imports do come via sea, we are a food-producing nation, so we're not strictly a true maritime nation, perhaps like the UK is, but that is like another discussion, I think, and you can get into semantics, which really isn't the object of this program.
Sure.
But then, so while we're talking about, the lack of sort of or reductions in funding that the Royal Navy has experienced, can you outline to the listener the reduction in spending or spending cutbacks that the Royal Navy suffered from since the end of the Cold War?
Okay, well, in very broad terms, kind of at the end of the Cold War, we were spending about 4% of GDP, gross domestic product, on the armed forces. That is now more than halved, so we're now down to less than 2% of GDP. So that has an enormous impact on the money available. That's the kind of big picture. Obviously, the way that those cutbacks have been made, for the most part, has been what I would call salami slicing, where the cuts have been gradual and small. So each year, we'll just we'll cut back on we'll retire a couple of frigates. We won't replace that, or there'll be small things. So it hasn't been like there's been some massive cull. It's been a very gradual process. Apart from in 2010, there was what's called the SDSR, the Strategic Defence and Security Review. And as we all know, what defence reviews basically are exercises in cutting. Generally not strategic, and they're generally not really related even to defence. They're run by the Treasury, basically looking for cuts. How can we get away with cuts that are least politically damaging? That is generally how defence reviews have gone. To be fair, the 1998 defence review conducted by the Labour government was actually quite good and had realistic aims, and there was very little cutting going on, and that was when the aircraft carriers were ordered. But by 2010, with the financial crash that happened in 2008, was it 8-9? There was a lot less money available suddenly. The deficit was beginning to get out of control, so the incoming coalition government was set on making spending cuts. Now, basically, most government departments had been experiencing increases in spending, particularly National Health Service, education and welfare. That, by and large, they had rocketed, in fact, since the end of the Cold War. Whereas defence, even in the supposedly good times, the economic boom of the 90s, the Labour government, defence spending was still, by and large, falling. So you could argue that defence had the strongest case of all those government departments to be ring-fenced. But our cowardly politicians always think they can get away with cutting defence spending because it's much lower on the political agenda. The man on the street is unaware of what's going on in defence by and large, whereas what happened in the NHS is much more in the front of his mind. So the government will always go for cuts in defence because it's a soft option, and that's happened repeatedly. And you can do that for so long, perhaps salami slicing. But the 2010 defence review was a disaster for the Navy. Obviously, the high-profile item that we lost was the aircraft, the HMS Ark Royal and Harrier. So we lost our carrier strike capability. We also lost 4 Type 22 frigates. Bear in mind, there are no new frigates going to be built for the Navy. Well, the Type 26 might arrive in 2022, something like that. And we'll be lucky if we get 13, which would replace the existing levels. There were manpower cuts. Now, the manpower cuts, in a way, have been the most devastating because we're now at a stage where the Navy is absolutely up against it, kind of trying to keep hold of enough people, particularly as the job market's improving. So we're particularly short of engineers, basically technical. Well, about half of the Navy are what would be described as technically trained and have a lot of options in the civilian job market and are leaving in their droves. You get into this vicious circle where the Navy is attempting to maintain the same levels of operations, but with fewer people and fewer ships, so there's more pressure. So the morale goes down, so more people leave. You get into this vicious circle. We're experiencing that in a big way at the moment. We've recently had to go to the US Coast Guard to borrow engineers from them. All of this is the result of the main. These are the kind of fallout from the 2010 Defence Review, which was the biggest kind of single cut since the Cold War. So yeah, that's a kind of quick summary. Obviously, there's loads more I could talk about. There's the cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, they've impacted on the defence budget. So rather than paying for those wars out of separate contingency funds, a lot of the funding came out of the defence equipment budget. So that's had an effect. There's also the dominance of the aerospace lobby, which is essentially the UK is dependent on one major monopoly, that's BAE Systems, for all its defence equipment, which has some advantages, but overall has a massive detrimental effect. There's very little competition. BAE is fundamentally an aerospace company. It makes the majority of its profits in aerospace, and shipbuilding, which it has wrapped up as well, is more of a sideline. Metal bashing is much less sexy, much less profitable than the aerospace side of its business. So all of these things are to the detriment of the state of the Royal Navy today. I'll leave it there for now. Could go on.
There's a couple of points worth mentioning here before we move on. The Type 26 frigate may be the basis that the Royal Australian Navy uses to design a frigate to replace the current Anzac-class frigates that are in service with the Royal Australian and Royal New Zealand Navy. That's just a brief side note there that is important. And
yeah, that would be desirable from our point of view, definitely.
They would, whether or not they built those ships in Australia is another matter. But it would be a feather in the cap for the Royal Navy if it was the basis for the design. And interestingly enough, just to put some perspective on what you were saying about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq affecting the Navy budget, that's happened in the States. You look at what's happened with the US Air Force and the number of F-22s and F-35s on order. The number's been cut because they've been paying for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now that I've just pointed that out to the listener, I think now that you've raised the monopoly of the UK defence industry, can you tell us about the potential pitfalls of the Royal Navy relying on only one shipyard for the construction of warships?
Okay. Well, in one sense, from a purely industrial and commercial point of view, it does make sense to build all your warships in one place and have a kind of centre of excellence where you've got all your skills on one site. It's more efficient. It's potentially quicker. So in terms of pure commerce and sort of efficient delivery, it does make sense. But, of course, defence assets, is a wider picture. So, for example, there's a lack of, let's say, for example, one day we needed to expand the Navy quite quickly. Let's say we got a government that finally was enlightened about needing a proper Navy and we needed to expand beyond our paltry Navy that we have at the moment. We don't have the option for expansion because it's all on one site. There's limited space. There's limited skills available. By having multiple shipyards, obviously you have a lot more options. That's one factor. You also have the obvious kind of vulnerability. There's no contingency. So let's imagine, I don't know, there's terrorist strike on the site, there's natural disaster, enemy action, everyone forgets that these days, accident, fire, all these things that could damage the site. You don't have the resilience that having multiple sites offers you. Now, resilience is just not even considered these days in our kind of accountancy-driven defence policy. That's a kind of luxury that barely even gets a look in. The fact that one day, we might be at war with somebody and, our facilities might get damaged, that kind of, the resilience factor is just not there at all. That goes across our entire defence industry, our entire defence system that is, there's no depth, no resilience. That's a whole other issue. We've gone about that. And also obviously lack of competition. Now, when BAE had 2 yards, so they had a yard in Portsmouth and they got yards in Glasgow. If we get rid of the yard in Portsmouth, there was always the possibility that even if BAE wanted to get out of the shipbuilding business or wanted to sell the Portsmouth yard, that it could have been taken over by another company like Babcock, for example, who could provide some real competition. Once we close down that yard, it's virtually impossible to regenerate it from scratch, or extremely expensive or very unlikely. So it rules out competition. So obviously that, that suits BAE. BAE are just doing what all big corporates do, and that is try and dominate the market. That's how capitalism works. In one sense, they're just doing what any other company would do. So you can't criticise them for acting in their own self-interest. But it's a government responsibility to ensure these monopolies aren't damaging our national interests. And obviously the other final issue is by putting all our sole complex warship building yard on one site in Glasgow, we become very vulnerable to the political landscape in that locality. So as you know, we've just dodged a bullet by avoiding Scotland breaking off to become an independent country, thank goodness. But Scottish nationalism is still very much alive and well, and that may not go away. And so it means the yard in Glasgow is very, very much subject to local politics, because shipbuilding is always political. Shipbuilding, most major procurements are political in the sense of the fact that, you're talking about the jobs in the local area so the local issues start to impact on decisions made about that yard. So, for example, if the Navy, as they did this week, wanted to look at sourcing warships abroad, however controversial that might be, that's another discussion. But supposing they did want to do that, it's a non-starter because the government is committed to providing work for Scottish workers in Glasgow as part of what they promised in the Scottish referendum debate. So, by putting all your eggs in one basket, you're kind of locking yourself into one side, the political issues of that side. There are lots of downsides. So yes, again, there's a lot more I could say about that, but that's a kind of overview.
And I just want to ask you this one question, and let me frame it like this to be fair to you. Since it is the very realistic possibility exists that only having one shipyard will eventually catch up with the UK for the reasons you outlined, what situation in the future would you foresee most likely happening that would cause that shipyard to be knocked out of action, or for this blunder to really strike home?
Okay. Well, I'm hoping. Let's hope that we never get into a situation where we're being bombed in the UK by, I don't know. Let's say for argument's sake, the Russians. That is obviously a kind of apocalyptic vision. We hope we won't get that far. What is much more likely is, say, a terrorist strike on the yard, or a bad fire, or an accident. Those are the more obvious, more likely circumstances. Who knows? Natural disasters. These are all possibilities. Okay, I accept they are probably not going to happen tomorrow, but they're kind of things that a good, sensible, responsible government that is thinking strategically, responsibly, long term considers.
Well, okay, I'll just sort of add in my, 2 pennies or 2 bob for the listener before I move on. If I had to pick what will catch up with any decision to go to one shipyard, I would say that it will be the Russians, but I will leave it at that. And I'm just going to say that the only thing worse than having one shipyard is like New Zealand, when you have no shipyards. So,
well, yeah, we could be heading that way as well, obviously.
And just for the sake of it, the Kiwi or even the Australian listener who tunes into this program, and when you're talking about, how important shipyards are to, local jobs, I think it's worth taking a look across the Tasman at the kind of wrangling the Australian government's having over the replacement of the Collins-class submarine.
Yeah.
And they're basically, in short, they're weighing up the cost of buying an off-the-shelf or overseas submarine from Japan versus building one locally. So that just puts another perspective on it.
I totally understand their dilemma, in that the Navy would probably much rather go to Japan and buy a good system off the shelf, whereas the government, local politicians would much rather build it locally because of the industrial benefits. Whenever with any major procurement program, you've got this kind of 3-sided balancing act. Okay, on one side you've got best value for the taxpayer, on the other side you've got best for industry, and then on the front line you've got what's best for the navy, and the forces. And you're constantly trying to balance these three competing demands. So I totally understand that. From my point of view, from the Navy's point of view, I'd be saying go and buy those Japanese subs because they're good, they'll work, you'll get them quicker, they'll probably cost less. But unfortunately, that might put some Australians out of work. So it's a very difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm watching that sort of debate with interest, but we have to move along from the Royal Navy's cousins.
Yes.
And we sort of have to. I think I'm going to move to the topic of aircraft carriers, actually. And this is another one of those questions that it just saddens me that it has to be asked. Yes. To be honest, given you only have to go back to the Falklands, and you wonder why anyone would argue against the Royal Navy having aircraft carriers. But that aside, can you tell the listener about the arguments made against the Royal Navy maintaining aircraft carriers, and why the arguments are so terribly flawed?
Okay. I'll go through the kind of classic arguments that you hear against carriers. First of all, they're too expensive. Okay, that's the first one. Well, they are relatively costly. Obviously, they're a lot more expensive than a frigate or whatever. Yes, they are big ticket items, and they are big. The ones that we're building at the moment are, second only really to the American supercarriers. So they are big, and they look like big, fat, expensive, targets for criticism. But in one sense, they're actually very good value for money. Those carriers we're building at the moment may last 50 years. Okay, and will be strategic tools for future governments that will come in very handy. The cost of those ships is, I don't know, we're talking about $6 billion, which in defence terms is actually quite small. I mean, if you take, for example, the Eurofighter Typhoon program, we've spent at least 25 odd billion on that, and we're still throwing money at that. And what that offers compared to the flexibility that the carriers offer, they are very good value for money. They're going to last a long time. Yes, they'll need maintenance, they'll need upgrades, they need aircraft, they need crewing, they have ongoing costs, of course. But in terms of what it gives you as a nation, I would argue they are very, very good value for money, pound for pound. It also makes sense to build big aircraft carriers because, as we've shown with the Invincible class, although they were small, we managed to do amazing things with them. But when it came to upgrading and actually operating them, having their space, their deck space was very restrictive. There wasn't space for much upgrades. It makes sense to build your carriers big, and you can upgrade them in the future. When planes develop in the future, who knows what aircraft will be flying from them in 30, 40 years' time. There's that flexibility is there built into the ship. Steel doesn't cost a lot, so in one sense, their size it is actually economical to build bigger, because it gives you flexibility in the future. Whereas if you build small, you haven't got options. You've either got to build a new ship from scratch, or you're stuck with old technology. So that's the cost argument. That's probably the first one. The next one would be kind of imperialism. Carriers are used for kind of big countries to kind of impose their will on smaller countries. Well, yes, that is true to one extent. One man's kind of imperialism is, maintaining peace and stability to another man. But every major nation, leading nation in the world, aspires to own or build aircraft carriers. So they haven't kind of had their day. Then they are still very useful tools. The way that the United States remains a superpower, its number one tool for enforcing its foreign policy is aircraft carriers. They are major assets that any leading nation aspires to own. How we use them, obviously, is down to having wise government, making good choices about how we use them when we deploy them. Obviously, they could be used in wrong ways, but they are fundamentally important tools for protecting our fleet, for protecting our maritime trade, for enforcing. Then they are. People think of them primarily as strike carriers, as launching bombing raids, but they're also a key part of protecting a fleet. If we ever have a blue water engagement, a major naval battle, you need aircraft carriers to protect your fleet, as the Falklands demonstrated. And you can't rely on land-based air cover to protect your fleet. That's a lesson that goes back to the World War II that the Navy learned very painfully. You need to take your air cover with you. Next argument against carriers would be that they're vulnerable. They're big, fat, juicy targets. We've got all these modern weapons that they're just asking to be sunk. Well, that's always been the case. With aircraft carriers since they were first built. They've always been supposedly vulnerable. Yes, they are vulnerable. They're vulnerable like any other surface ship, but they are also heavily protected. An aircraft carrier will go to sea with a layered defence that have frigates, destroyers, and submarines potentially surrounding it, protecting it. So you have layered defence. There are the supposed new weapons, such as sort of ballistic anti-ship missiles that the Chinese supposedly possess. Again, modern defences are evolving to cope with them. The Type 45 destroyers have been tried out their weapon systems in ballistic missile defence. The Americans. So basically, defensive weapons are always evolving to cope with new offensive weapons. I guess the biggest single vulnerability to aircraft carriers is submarine. I'd point out generally, although the Royal Navy is far too small, it is still a world leader in anti-submarine warfare. And yes, the submarine threat will always be there. No, I would never claim carriers are invulnerable. I would also point out that the land-based air lobby they don't mention actually the vulnerability of air bases. No aircraft carrier has actually been sunk since the Second World War, whereas land air bases have been overrun by the enemy with bomb. Just recently in Afghanistan, sort of ragtag Taliban force managed to break into Camp Bastion and destroy a load of US Harriers on the ground. Their biggest single loss of air power since Vietnam. So in one sense, the land-based airbase is just as vulnerable. You just punch in the GPS data into your smart munition and bang, there you go. They're fixed point. They can't move. A carrier can cover 500 miles in a day, whereas your land base is a fixed point that the enemy knows about from day one, knows exactly where it is. So both have their vulnerabilities, but the carrier has different kind of vulnerabilities. Obviously, if a carrier gets hit, it's harder to repair than a land-based airbase, obviously. But finding and hitting the carrier is a hell of a lot more difficult. And finally, the classic argument against carriers are they're no use against terrorists or the asymmetric threats. That's a classic one that the army's always trotting out. When they were struggling in Afghanistan with insufficient equipment, it was like, we're spending all this money on useless carriers that can't fight the Taliban. Well, that's a kind of ridiculous short-term argument that obviously carriers, which can last potentially 50 years, these are we're taking a long-term sensible view of having flexible forces that can deal with different threats as they evolve in the future, and the carriers are part of that. Now, obviously, wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, they're short-term affairs. Carriers are not obviously the answer to terrorism, although carriers have been used to attack terrorist bases and fly reconnaissance and gather information. So they are part of the story in terms of maritime security and attacking terrorist threats, possibly. But it's a kind of ludicrous criticism. I mean, we get the same kind of criticism about the nuclear deterrent. People say, they're used against terrorists. Well, no, they're not. They're not meant to be used against terrorists. Nuclear deterrence is deterrence against other nuclear-armed states. Likewise, carriers, by and large, their main purpose is deterrence against other naval forces, although they can obviously be used to bomb land targets. Those are the kind of classic anti-carrier arguments. There are probably lots more.
And I just want to ask you one question before we leave the topic of aircraft carriers. And I think if there's one thing that's missed in the argument from what I've seen is that how important would you rate it that the aircraft carriers are for the skills base they maintain? So that's the air crews, the crews that maintain the aircraft, the institutional knowledge they bring. Because if or when the Royal Navy has to expand to defend the UK, there is going to be need to build more aircraft carriers, and what form they will take is another discussion. But wouldn't you say it's very important that the existing skills base is there, that it can be expanded upon?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, not so much the construction skills base, because that's relatively straightforward. What I would say is the more tricky skills base is actually operating carriers and having the experience of operating planes off a deck, managing them. Is a very specialist, difficult task. It's a complicated. Naval aviation is complicated and dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Unfortunately, the Navy has lost some of that experience anyway. By when Ark Royal and the Harriers were lost, some of that institutional knowledge was lost. We have kind of managed to keep hold of it kind of on a shoestring by sending pilots and deck handlers to the United States and even the French Navy are assisting us in kind of keeping those skills at a bare minimum baseline level of skill is being kept alive and is being worked up ready for the new carriers. Obviously, operating vertical landing, short takeoff F-35B is slightly more straightforward. Catapult and trap aircraft that we would have liked to have had. That's a whole other debate. We won't get into that now. But nevertheless, yes, you're right that maintaining that kind of institutional knowledge is very important. It's a valuable asset that can easily be lost. We're barely clinging onto it at the moment, and I'm sure we will find when HMS Queen Elizabeth comes into service and the F-35Bs are finally delivered, it will take some time to bed down and become fully competent and worked up to kind of a pitch where we're ready to go and take on frontline operations. Will take time, unfortunately. That's another problem. That's the delay in which government, the Labour government created in the carrier programme, is being felt. In that we're having a long carrier gap. The Royal Navy doesn't actually have any aircraft carriers at the moment. So yes, it's a thorny problem, maintaining institutional knowledge.
And I just want to touch on here very briefly for the listener. If one looks to the closer to my part of the world, the Chinese, with their first aircraft carrier, are learning institutional knowledge as this program is recorded.
Absolutely, yeah.
They're undergoing flight training. So, and I don't want to take us entirely, off on a tangent, but it's worth noting that the Chinese shipyards aren't going to have any difficulty building more carriers. It's that they need the flight crews to train the pilots for the additional ships.
Yeah. They've already lost a couple of pilots recently. Work on their new carrier, working up, because it is difficult and dangerous. As the Royal Navy going back decades has discovered that you lose pilots because it's a dangerous place to be unless you really know what you're doing. The Chinese are probably learning these lessons the hard way. Yes, watch out.
And just, before we wrap up this program, there's a very disturbing development that could afflict the Royal Navy and it could afflict the US Navy and could afflict allied navies as well. But with weapons platforms such as the Harpoon missile, they're basically due for replacement in the near future. And with the ongoing cuts in defence spending in the USA, coupled with those in the UK, is it possible the Royal Navy faces a future war with obsolete weapons platforms?
It's certainly a possibility. By and large, our Ministry of Defence, they would rather not send something to sea than send something obsolete to sea. So their policy normally is to decommission anything that's obsolete. So our Navy at the moment, by and large, most of the stuff that is actually on the front line is fairly modern and fairly decent equipment. The problem comes, as you say, in that we simply don't replace things. Now, the Harpoon is a classic case in point. The Americans are developing what's called LASRAM, long-range anti-ship missile. I'm not quite sure how far down the road of development that is. The UK has no involvement in that programme. There's no stated plan to buy that system. Most desirably, to integrate it with the F-35 would be great. Nevertheless, that could change. It's a matter of priorities. Unfortunately, anti-shipping seems to be so far down the Navy's list of priorities these days, it barely gets a look in. So there are numerous weapon systems and platforms that are becoming obsolete with either no plan or a gap in capability because there isn't a replacement being developed or bought simply because of money or because of lack of long-term vision or because of other priorities. Yes, it's definitely a concern. Like I say, at least what I would say is, by and large, the Royal Navy at sea today has modern, good equipment, but it's just far too few. It's a lack of hulls is the bigger concern. What we have got is very good, but there's just so little of it.
And just before we wrap up and the cake is served with coffee, can you tell the listener the Save the Royal Navy's campaign's website address and their Twitter handle?
Sure. Okay. The website is www.savetheroyalnavy.org. That's essentially kind of, there are posts on that not that frequently, maybe every couple of weeks. There are various essays of different types. Some sort of more detailed analysis, some kind of response to news events, various other odd bits and pieces, book reviews. There's a whole, variety of stuff on there. So take a look and have a look round. Do comment. There's lots of opportunity for comment. There's some very kind of hot debates going on there in some areas. particularly on the manpower issue. Then the Twitter account is at Navy Lookout, and that generally tweeting most days, sort of a variety of kind of Navy, mostly Royal Navy related news, some international related stuff, particularly where it's kind of relevant to the RN. But yeah, that's very active, growing Twitter feed of. If you want to know what's happening to the Royal Navy on a kind of minute by minute basis, follow that feed and you'll get a pretty good idea. There's also various other social media platforms. We're on Pinterest, the various boards, particularly with kind of new equipment, photos and images. Flickr and Storify. We kind of occasional, naval news stories. We gather them all on Storify. So yeah, all the links to those accounts are on the website. So thanks a lot, guys.
And thank you very much for joining us in the Lens of History studio.
No problem. Pleasure.
You have been listening to The Lens of History with Luke Herbert.